So we've got a 40K follow-up podcast here to a question from a recent podcast. The allure of Khorn, of glory on the tabletop, compels me to answer this. Certainly up in the archives, I've talked more about this idea of running an assault-based army in 40K, analyzing my own Khornate glory army, looking at this idea of wave theory, having different parts of your army moving forward, essentially answering the question against a gunline army. The question was, Fritz, I'm running a gunline army, I'm getting blasted off the table. How do we even do this? And that is up in the archive podcast. I will let you kind of focus on that, but I wanted to push out there and answer this question. The number one thing, there's a lot of interlocking pieces that you need, but the number one thing that you need that I've noticed, and this started with playing Black Templars back in the day. That's where I first started really getting into this love of close combat, this love of assault in 40K. At the time, everybody's playing Marines, as always. Marines are shooting everywhere. The Templar Codex was interesting because the Marines could take bolt pistols and chainswords. Space Wolves weren't really where they are right now. And it was a refreshing way to play that. Plus, you could play the Emperor's Champion. And at the time, you had the Holy Orb of Antioch, which you could throw and it would blow up. And I would say, you know, the Holy Orb and get into that narrative on there. That then led into Tyranids. I picked up a Tyranid army from the club. It was all close combat. And now, next thing you know, I'm running Space Bugs with literally zero shooting in there. And this is where I first learned, of course, there's a learning curve, and dozens of games getting blasted off the table, wondering why the next day I can't even move. I'm like, my back is just totally shot because I'm leaning over the table, literally putting down and moving hundreds and hundreds of gaunts, and then turn to taking them off the table. That's where I first started to realize I need critical mass. I need critical mass. And then when I reached for Khornate Glory and started my Berserkers of Scalathrax list, that's where all the kind of Harlequins running Space Elf clowns, that influenced me tremendously also, where you had an elite army, an elite group, and trying to do it and run it from there. So all these influences bringing it in led me to realize the number one thing is critical mass. So essentially what you're trying to do is reach the other side of the table. And the way I express this, it physically helps a little bit. I won't say pause this podcast, but if you could do the math, crunch the numbers in your head. If I put out a unit of Berserkers and I physically take the dice that each Berserker can generate in shooting and in the assault, that's the volume of dice it can generate. As I take losses, I'm going to physically be losing dice. And I take losses on the way in until I get to my opponent, their deployment zone, because I'm going to have to run to them. No one's ever seen a close combat. Well, I take that back. Most people see a close combat army, and they know the limitations of assault in 40K, and they know how the rules favor shooting, and the fact that it's a finite gaming table and you only have one way to approach. So they're going to sit there and castle up and blast you off the table. Unless you're facing a both close combat army on there. I fought close combat Grey Knight army recently, which is both of us charging to the middle of the table for kind of glory on there. But essentially they're going to sit back and they're going to shoot. I guess I could have sat back. Well, no, I didn't sit back and just shoot because I don't have much shooting in my army. Grey Knights certainly do, but Khorn would not. There would be no glory in sitting there and waiting on there. It's always forward. So you need this idea of critical mass. When you get across the table and you're physically losing dice, then you're in the assault, and you need to have enough dice to generate to be able to beat your opponent, to beat those units. And then after you beat those units, of course, you're going to eat more fire, and you're going to get smaller and smaller. So you need to look at your model collection, and you need to look at what you have and what you want to play. And this I can't answer for you. I can only share what I do in my Khornate list as an example. You need a trash mob. You need some sort of units that can put out a little bit of dice, and maybe you get lucky, and maybe your opponent, you roll high, they roll low. That's essentially how you win 40K. But to have enough of a model mass that it's a threat. It's something they can't ignore, but it's not that expensive in terms of points, and it needs to be able to cover a big area. This could be one big unit, although then it could get locked down, or it could be 3 or 4 somewhat big units pushing and working together. I do this with cultists on there. I flood cultists forward. They're on the way in. They're going to do a little bit of damage, but it's essentially, it forces a choice between my opponent. They see those rhinos coming up. They know what's in those rhinos. They see that land raider coming up. They know what's in that land raider. That's what they should be focusing on. But I've got a lot of cultists coming forward on there, and they have to make that decision. And usually I'm forcing them to deal with those cultists. That's what I'm putting in range first. That's where they're going to go. You're going to lose them. You're going to lose points from your list, but you need to have enough model mass of expendable, semi-expendable stuff. And if you can also balance it out by giving out damage to your opponent, that's better, so that when your main stuff hits, you have that enough dice. You can generate enough dice. And I learned this primarily with my Tyranids. Ironically enough, playing against Imperial Guard, where I am running across the table and they're just blasting me away. And I'm like, this was at the time, I'm like, I don't have enough mass. And it's a little deceptive, because you can take enough losses and still crash into your opponent's lines, and you're like, well, I made it. But you took enough losses going in, you don't have the long-term ability to generate dice over 2 or 3 turns to significantly weaken their army. So you hit their front lines, you take a lot of skulls, you put them to the bolt pistol and chainsword, or in the case of Tyranids, the claw and tooth, but then over the next 2 turns, the return fire just decimates you. And you're like, wait, I thought I made it. No, you didn't have enough mass. The other way to deal with that, building second way, you need to lock your opponent down in their deployment zone. You need to give them some targets to shoot at. Again, expendable. So we're looking at stuff that's high threat, low value. Of course, that's like the secret sauce formula in 40K. But what's in your group that you can do that? Maybe some Terminators to zap in, or some sort of unit that can suddenly appear based on what you're playing in your codex. 2 or 3 little bit of groups to do that. So turn 1, turn 2, there's something else to focus on. So turn 2, turn 3, you're hitting your opponent's lines and you're there. That is the starting point. That is what I would recommend. And there's a lot of pressure, a lot of gaming pressure in playing an assault army. And I mean physical pressure, because you are running across the table and you're compressing that, and you are taking losses. You have to sit there and take it for a turn or 2. But if you make it, and you can gang up on one side of the table if you can magnify your forces, and you hit with the different waves. Again, that's up in the podcast archive under Warhammer 40K. It's also a link to my blog. We talk about this. I've got examples of my Berserker army in there. If you're playing Chaos, some ideas. If you're not playing Chaos, the gods call you. But if you don't hear their call, certainly you can find out how the units work and figure them out in your own army. But when you hit, and there's that glory, there's that chance for glory on there, we want that critical mass. So I wanted to push this up because it's challenging to play an assault-based army. It really is. The rules do not favor it. Games Workshop, I still believe this is a holdover. I still believe that this is, we'll kind of end on this foundation point. The DNA of Games Workshop, at the time, they were never able to break from it. They did it with Age of Sigmar. This is what leads me to believe that eventually 40K will be somewhat Sigmarized. But the general idea always was, before Age of Sigmar, it was, well, if you want to play close combat, play Warhammer Fantasy. Yeah, it's got some shooting. Yeah, it's got some magic. But essentially, it's you crashing together, doing the Braveheart thing, and doing that whole part of the game. If you want shooty, then you play Warhammer 40,000. Yeah, we got a little bit of an assault. Yeah, in 4th edition 40K, assault was king, but don't worry, we quickly corrected that. So you are, by running an assault-based army, you are up against some rules that don't favor that to begin. But that said, the glory of getting into the assault and watching your opponent, I love that pressure as you're moving forward. And, okay, they blast you off the table, game over, let's reset. But if it works and if you can pull it off through tactics and a little bit of luck and a little bit of martial glory to Khorn, running across the table and they shoot at you and you're taking models off and they're like, I love 40K. This is what I'm talking about. This is a great game. And then you make it to the midfield and Zerkers are coming out and cultists are coming out and Hellbrutes are coming out and they're like, I don't know, we're getting closer here. Okay, first rank fire, second rank fire, concentrate fire, everything, and then you crash into the lines and you can see the energy drain from them. You can see that moment where they're like, this is real. This is a major problem now. And on the opposite side, you can feel pumped because your berserkers are just like furious with bolt pistols and chain swords and chain axes and just going like crazy on everything on there. And then as we get to the end of the game, it's just a sea of beaten models with you're 6 models left for glory on there. I mean, that is the narrative. That is, for me, what I want to play in 40K rather than okay, min-max everything and roll some dice and just kind of go back and forth. There's a lot of great ways to play it, is what I'm saying. But if you want assault, if you want close combat, there is no room for error, and you got to be on top of your game in terms of the questions that you need to answer based how you're going to do it, what you're going to do, how's it going to happen, and we'll push that out, and we'll leave that follow-up for another day after you've had a chance to check out my archive.